Welcome to the week 4 recap video for our 2025 challenge. My name is Sarah Merriweather.
I'm Pastor Bruce.
We are so glad that you are joining us today. We're taking a look back at what we have been reading in the Bible together in our 2025 challenge. In our 49-week reading plan, we're taking a look back at what we read in week 4. So actually days 22 to 28. We're hoping to maybe help answer some questions and give you some tools to go deeper in your own study. So as we get rolling today, Pastor Bruce, would you begin with prayer for us?
Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and ask now that your Holy Spirit dwell among us, opening up the lens, your lens, into the reading of today's word. Amen.
Amen. All right, we're just going to jump right on in today, Pastor Bruce. So,
Day 22.
Day 22. In day 22, we took a look. We were all over the Bible, as we are typically in this plan. We hope that by day 22, you're kind of getting the gist of it.
Right.
That's some discussion we've had with people. It's like, okay, it's taken me a little while, but now I get the pattern. I like it. Because you can start to see those connections, but there are some challenges associated with that we're actually going to kind of deal with at the end of today to maybe help you look at the overall timeline of what's happening.
Well, and the exciting part is last week, actually, after you made it through last week into this week, if it takes 6 weeks to build a habit, you're over halfway to building a habit if you're doing this every day.
I know, right? Isn't it amazing? Some people say it takes 21 days. So on day 22, it means we read it. We've gotten there. So
yeah, those are short-term habits.
Short-term habits.
Long-term is
okay.
6.
Fair enough. But, our goal is every day. So here we are, day 22. So we started off here in the Gospel of John, and we actually take a look here at Jesus' first miracle at Cana, where he turns water into wine for his mom. His mom comes up to him, hey, Jesus, they're out of good wine.
Yeah, but not only did he create good wine, like he created the best wine.
Oh yeah. It's a cool story. But then right after that story, he moves on to, and this is, forgive me, Jesus, but he kind of throws a little bit of a temper tantrum at the temple courts. It's kind of the way I would describe it.
Yeah. Like, if these stories were actually back to back, it would make a lot more sense of Jesus making some wine and then flipping some tables.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's kind of crazy, but anyhow, so lots of stuff happening here in this part of John. But one of the things that we noted as we were reading through this week, and then there was a funny comment on it, but we know the Gospel of John, Pastor Bruce, often gives us the answer for what we're reading right in the verse, like the explanation, the backstory, or
it'll get prophecy.
The foreshadowing.
He will do something, and then it'll say, and this was to fulfill the prophecy spoken in this, and then it'll have a bit of the prophecy there.
Right. And so that is something that we only really see in the Gospel of John, compared to the other 3, which we often refer to, because that's what they're referred to as the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, we had one of our plan participants who said, well, then if that's the case, now John is my favorite book of the Bible, and could John please give the Old Testament some tips?
Yeah. I'm with them.
Yeah.
It's,
yeah.
I'm a big fan of John.
Yes, you do love John, but some examples of this, just so that you kind of know what we're talking about here, in John chapter 2, verses 19 through 22, this is Jesus talking about the temple. Jesus answered them in verse 19, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, and I believe this was the disciples at this point, were the they. Is that right, Pastor Bruce?
No, I think it's the Pharisees that he's arguing with.
Yeah. Anyway, they replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So it's kind of a confusing bit here in the Gospel of John, because you'll have this like narrative happening right now, and then they'll jump ahead to something that, like, we don't know this is going to happen.
Yeah, do you remember the TV show The Wonder Years?
I do.
Okay,
yes.
The same kind of thing. It's like reflecting back. I remember.
Right.
But you're watching it in the moment.
Right. And so it's an interesting way to read it. The Gospel of John assumes that we already know the story of the resurrection.
Right.
We know what happens. And so kind of takes us back and helps us understand how we get there, which, know, you can like or not like.
Right. So next we moved from John into Genesis, and from there we moved into Pharaoh's strange dreams. And this particular story dealing with Joseph has a special place in your heart.
It does. I would not declare myself the most musical person. I like to sing, not in front of people. And I used to play some instruments. But when I was in high school, I decided that my senior year, I was going to be in the musical. And I know that, music's like your thing, Pastor Bruce. So we're on very different kind of bits here. But I decided I was going to be in the musical. And the musical of all things was Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which is an incredible musical.
Yeah, but it's the character you played.
Yes. Now, the funny part here, and you'll have to do a little Bible digging to understand why this is funny. We're not going to give you the whole answer. But I played Potiphar's wife.
And Potiphar's wife was?
She was, let's put this a nice way, she was the temptress that ultimately got Joseph thrown in prison.
So I'm sure we'll get to that story at some point.
Yeah, we'll get there at some point.
All right. But what's going on here is Pharaoh's having some dreams.
Oh, yeah.
And he wants them interpreted. And so that's what's going on here.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that you're going to find out is we're continuing the themes of food.
Right. Yeah. So we started with, Jesus's miracle, all about wine, right? And now we move on to, we've got Pharaoh is having these dreams about, 7 skinny cows, 7 fat cows, and, right, all the stuff.
And so Joseph ends up interpreting them. After he was in prison, this got him out of prison for 7 years of famine versus 7 years of abundance. And so during the years of abundance, save up for the famine that's to come.
Yeah. I mean, I actually love the song from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat about this, because they do a whole thing where like the 7 years of corn come in. And I mean, it's great. You can look it up. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere.
Is there a recording
of
me you from high school?
It probably exists somewhere. Yes.
Friends, we have a new mission.
It probably exists somewhere. But anyhow, one of the things that I really, just as a sidestep on this, that I love about this whole story is that it is one of those times, again, it obviously is a theme we see over and over and over in the Bible, but where God uses, what looks like the end for Joseph and redeems his story into something pretty incredible. I mean, you see Joseph go, I think in like a day, from being in prison to essentially running all of Egypt.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty big change in a day there, and all because he remained faithful to God.
Well, and Joseph's whole story is like that.
Yes, I mean, many times over. So, one of the downsides, I think, to this Bible reading plan is that, particularly when we get into these long narratives that are over a few chapters, sometimes it's difficult to follow them in the way that this plan does it.
You're jumping in right at the exciting part
right
in this one.
And so this might be one of those where, if you've got a little extra time, like on Sundays when it's just that one verse, maybe go back and reread the whole story of Joseph, so you kind of get the idea of, what got him here. How did he, he was sold by his brothers.
Yeah, it's a few chapters long, but it's worth it.
Yeah, definitely worth the narrative there. So, all right, now that we continue this theme of food, looking at clean and unclean food in the book of Deuteronomy. And we had some questions come up about this, Pastor Bruce, about, to discuss why we don't follow these same rules today as Christians. And we may have touched on this one of the other weeks a little bit as well, but I think it bears repeating, because there's a lot of rules here about clean and unclean food.
Right. I mean, the main reason is when you start to get into the book of Acts and some of the epistles, some of the letters, what's going on here is there's actually a divisiveness going on in the Christian church, shocker, between Jewish members of Christianity and those who are not Jewish. Who was Jesus' message for? And so you have this, in the book of Acts, you have this story that I have always called the barbecue text, and people laugh at me, where Peter's on a rooftop, and it says God lowers these sheets before him, and all these unclean food start coming down, and God says, eat, and Peter says, no. And this happens like 3 times. But it's in that message, what really is happening is it's really not about the food. It is, but it's not. But it's really a message to Peter, who was really a proponent for a period of time of the Jewish side of the Christian faction versus Paul, who is more of the Gentile side.
You're reaching out to, yes, the non-Jews.
The non-Jews.
Yes.
Okay. And so he realized that there were certain barriers. We talked about this last week or the week before. Like there are barriers like circumcision. Oh, that's a barrier. Okay. Food was a barrier. And so by grafting Gentiles onto the promise of salvation through Jesus, there were certain traditional Jewish laws that were no longer needed to be upheld, according to certain parts of Christianity. Now, there are some Christian sects that still practice clean food.
Right.
I believe Seventh-day Adventists are one of the groups.
Interesting.
That still do this. But that's the reason why, is the clean and
But
unclean.
for mainline Christianity.
For mainline Christianity, that's the reason why. Because when you look at the foods or the wearing the certain types of fabric or some of the laws that we no longer hold as sacred, that's why. These things became barriers. And so that's when you get into theological conversations of what did Jesus come to do? To complete the law, to break the law, to...
ultimately, what we want to hear and learn from this is that the message of Jesus, at least, in the way particularly that Paul taught and preached it after Jesus ascended, was that Jesus' message is for everyone. And that message should be more important than, following these rules that were there to be put in place. We're actually going to get into that and quite a bit more here when Jesus does things like he heals on the Sabbath, right? These are things we're going to see here.
He's once again, he goes back to what sums up the law.
Yeah.
Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor. And so if the things don't have anything to do with that, is Jesus does change how thinking of the right word, how the system of salvation works. It's no longer a works-based,
right,
but a faith-based.
Right. I don't know that we've made it clear for you, but the bottom line is you can eat.
Keep going. We'll talk about it. I'll keep preaching.
You can eat the food. Right. So that was the one there. I did have a good laugh with one of the plan participants who was laughing about she was working with one of her kids doing some dishes and had this whole conversation about clean versus unclean. And she said, I never would have had this, conversation if we hadn't been doing the Bible plan. We had a good laugh about that. So you never know what the Bible's going to inspire you to be talking about on a daily basis. All right. As we move into day 23, we actually come up with what I think was maybe the most complicated question of the week, but one that is important for us to tackle because we are going to be getting into the parts of the Bible where we're going to see this a lot more. And so we kind of want to discuss this now. We won't stop discussing it, but at least let's begin the discussion now. So the question was, God allowed Israel to triumph over so many tribes as they reached their promised land. This plan participant says, I always wonder why so much bloodshed was necessary.
A tough question.
It is.
First thing we're going to start off with saying is we're not going to start with, did these events actually happen? We're going to take the Christian point of view that, yes, these events happened.
Okay, right.
Okay, so let's take that off.
Historically.
Right, historically.
Biblically, historically,
So
yes.
the question is, was it necessarily condoned by God, or was this, as we've looked at, like we talked about the
colander.
The colander.
Yeah.
Was this the author's best way to describe what was a normal part of human life and warfare at the time? Because we also have to remember, guess what? History always says to the victors,
yeah, go the spoils.
Go the spoils. They write the history. And so what was God's desire? And so we know God's desire isn't wicked, but he hopes that the wicked will turn away from sin.
Right. And we see many, many times where God's desire is very clear, gives opportunities for people to say, repent, turn from this. God would much rather people turn to him than to stay in their sin.
And there is an actual kind of transition that happens that we don't talk about, that we've become comfortable with in some sense. And so, okay, God's original plan when all the people became wicked on earth was, I'm just going to destroy the earth.
Right.
I'm going to flood them all out.
Correct.
Now, we look at this as being kind of I don't think we question it as much. Because we go, oh, the whole world's wicked. He'll start with one person. Okay, that seems good. And so since it's coming straight from God, I believe there's this aspect of, we almost hold it as reverent what God did. But as soon as God assigns the task to someone else.
We chatted about this earlier. That's an interesting way. I mean, I have to be honest. I've never really struggled with the story of Noah and the ark.
Right.
Because you're like focused on, oh, how adorable, the animals 2 by 2. And he saves, you look at the story of the redemption. Oh, well, he's saving Noah and his family who were faithful and righteous. But I think we do tend to overlook this. Okay, well, he also literally, flooded the whole world that was left because they were evil and had turned from God.
Right. And
so there is a consequence to that.
Right. And so what you're bringing up here is you have the same kind of thing, but there's still a lot more things going on. Why does God do this?
Yeah.
He didn't want people to be drawn further away from God.
Right.
There were always these things of don't go and take wives of the local communities, women and those kind of things, because they were scared they would draw the Israelite men into these other religions. Actually, later on in scripture, this happens. They don't want to deal with the children growing up with the idols of their parents.
God knew what was in their hearts,
right,
and knew what their temptations were, and knew what their propensity was for sin. And we can wrestle with how it was done, but the ideology behind it is that what God wanted for the people of Israel were to be set apart and holy.
Right.
That's the goal, set apart and holy. And so was looking for a way to reclaim them and make them in right relationship with God, and wanted to remove all of the things that would tempt them to turn away from God again.
I mean, and here's a spoiler. What we're doing right now is kind of talking about the possibilities. If you're looking for a direct answer, you're not going to get one from us. I can tell you what I kind of think why. I mean, historically, there's reasons for doing this, but if it's placed into context, it makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, because we're also hearing stories about a civilization that we just simply can't relate to. For example, this was when you and I talked about, and this could be argued. I don't know that there's proof of this, for example, but there was one scholar that suggested that, when we look at the killing of the women and children, for example, that just seems like such an atrocity to us.
Right.
And rightly so. But this scholar was suggesting, but perhaps in that time period, because all of the power in the families was with the man, that if you had just left the women and children on their own, that they would have been subject to starvation and, potentially abuse and slavery and some pretty awful things. And so suggested that, in that case, could it even be argued that it was merciful? Now that's a theological stretch, but an interesting way to look at.
I'd really have to wrestle with that.
I'm not saying we don't have to wrestle with it. Okay.
Right.
But what I'm trying to say here is, we're hearing these stories in a way that we just can't relate to.
Right.
And so if we can at least allow ourselves to go into this conversation and go, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Right.
Maybe it doesn't mean the same thing that it means in my world today. Is that challenging? For sure. But the reality is the Bible's full of times where whole villages, whole cities are wiped out and specifically list the women and children. So we do have to find some way to wrap our minds around that and wrestle with that.
Right. But the other thing that also happens, which I don't think we bring up, is I don't have an account. I could probably look one up.
Yeah.
But there's also an equal number of times where it's not about the killing of the whole community. You'll see through psalms and prayers that connect back to other things, or even in the stories themselves, where God talks about driving them from the land. So it's not always killing. And we know that many of these groups that were where it was a city was destroyed may have been a military outpost compared to just a city. Drive them from the land, out of your land, out of the promised land.
Yeah.
And so there's some of that because depending on your interpretation, you don't want to turn God into a genocidal maniac.
Yeah. I mean, and some people, particularly those who, who are not Christian and want to point out the infallibility or fallibility of the Bible, rather, will point that out and say, well, here's why Christianity is hypocritical, or why, you can't say God is love. And then we look at these stories. These are things we have to wrestle with.
Right.
I hate to just keep using that as kind of the play here, but that's the reality. What we know, maybe what we can take with it or from it, is that God's character cannot live with sin. God cannot be with sin. We see that in the Old Testament, that theme repeated over and over. And sin requires punishment or atonement. And so, as you said, it feels easier when we talk about the flood. Feels different when God's commanding others to do it. But the reality is that God's still looking for a way to make us right.
Right. And in the Old Testament, particularly when we talk about war, every war was considered a holy war.
Yeah.
So that should add some perspective also. But also God sees things from an eternal perspective. And so some ways it's just trusting his ways are not our ways.
Right.
And still not.
Yeah.
Trying to line those things up.
So, this is a hard topic, friends. And like we say on the Unpasteurized podcast, if you join us on there, we're not even going to pretend to have all the answers on it. We've got a lot of opinions. But this is one of those things that, at least as far as Pastor Bruce and I are concerned, these are things that we've just got to wrestle with. We have to do our best to put it into context. And, back to that colander example that we gave in our week 3 recap, we have to ask the question, okay, where does this fit for you as you're reading the Bible? Where does this fit? How can you put this through the lens and filter of Jesus? And maybe that helps you get to a place where you can see the overall learning from it and not be so caught up in the what are pretty awful realities.
Yeah. So figure out where you stand now, because let's continue to read and see where you end up.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah, definitely.
So only 4 weeks in.
Yes.
So
digging right into the tough stuff. Okay. And I think this is a lot of the reason why people are afraid to read the Old Testament, Pastor Bruce.
Yeah.
You get to these parts, you go, I don't know what to do with this. So I'm just going to leave this there.
Yeah.
And I love this plan that kind of forces us into these different books each day, and we can struggle with it. We can wrestle with it. We can see the connections. Hopefully it's helping us see the narrative of the Bible as a whole.
Right.
All right. So then we moved on, even still here on day 23. We actually spent a little bit of time in Proverbs 30, and had some questions around that from one of our plan participants. And I thought this was a good little pause for us to take, because this was an opportunity to share some of the tools that we use when you want to go deeper in your study. They had a question about, there was a listing being used in Proverbs 30. It talked about 3 items, then 4 items. And there was a reason for that, but it took a little digging to figure out why that was there. And so, when you're reading the Bible, I think what we want to sort of just be upfront and say is, we have no expectation that you read it and just everything makes sense.
If you do, please come see me. I will use you as a resource.
For sure. You're going to have questions. We actually love that you have questions. The Bible is an incredible, book of great depth that should cause us to have questions and to want to research and explore and discuss in community. I mean, that's what Bible study is all about. It's what this plan when we ask questions. So, one of our plan participants actually mentioned this week. I actually think it's in the week 5 readings when she mentioned it, but we saw it before we did this video. One of the things you can do is just write in the YouVersion app. If you are reading in the YouVersion app, you can click on a verse, kind of underlines the verse, and then at the bottom of your screen is going to give you all kinds of options. So if you kind of swipe up on that, you now have access potentially to, depending on what the verse is,
Right.
depending on what the verse is, you've got like, videos and commentaries and other Bible study tools just right there in the YouVersion app. But the one that I actually shared for this Proverbs 30 was the Blue Letter Bible app. You may have heard us talk about it on here before. I'm going to link it again today in the video description because it is just such a good app. Right in there, you can look up a verse and you can do anything from looking at word studies, which, one of my favorite things to do, but you can look at the original, Greek or Hebrew, depending on what book of the Bible you're in. You can get commentaries, which is where I pulled this information from. So you can see what Bible scholars that are, kind of well-known and vetted is what I would say, not just your random Wikipedia opinions. Okay. These are, scholars that have some stuff behind them.
Right.
We could kind of trust what they have to say for the most part. And that's there. I mean, there's just a wealth of information there. So what I personally like to do is if I'm reading the Bible, oftentimes I'll have my hard copy out. I'm highlighting, taking notes in it. I'll maybe have my app out, use that as a resource for Blue Letter Bible or YouVersion. Lots of different ways that you can jump back and forth. And these are just kind of touching the surface there. But I think what we want to encourage you to do is to pause, give yourself time. And if you don't make it through a day's readings on that day and you need to catch back up the next day or Sunday, when we just have that one verse, do that. Take the time. If God is leading you somewhere, if there's a question that comes up,
follow the nudge.
Follow the nudge. Yes. And so if you need some help figuring out what resources are out there and available to help you follow that nudge, do it.
Could be the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I think my only caution would be, Bruce, sometimes when we have questions, we'll just, put it out for a Google. Just be careful where you're pulling your resources from. Right. Because there are all kinds of people and groups that have opinions about the Bible. So just, you want to be careful. It's one of the reasons that we share the Bible Project. We kind of know that, there are theological underpinnings and backing there, and that's something we feel confident about sharing.
And you can always put in Wesleyan Understanding or United Methodist Church Understanding.
Yes.
It'll take you to some resources.
Absolutely.
Also.
But certainly reach out if you've got questions about something. So
day 24.
Yeah, day 24.
We did some readings from John and Genesis and Joshua and Isaiah. From John, Jesus meets a Samaritan woman and tells her things about her that he shouldn't know. And it kind of proves his, I love the word you use here, supernaturalness.
Supernaturalness. And, this really is the theme that we see in the Gospel of John. One of the things that sets it apart, again, from the Synoptic Gospels, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is this theme, as you would describe it, of the cosmic Christ.
Right.
So understanding that, yes, Jesus is God incarnate, is human, fully human, but is also fully divine. And we really look at that divinity here.
Right. What I talk about when I talk about this, which I think is what you kind of wanted to discuss a little bit, was this thing we call Christology. And it's how we relate to Christ. And there's something called a high Christology and a low Christology. And this isn't a one is better than the other, high, low. This is a low Christology means that you tend to lean into the human Christ. Christ is fully human.
Sure.
It doesn't mean you don't believe in the divinity, but that's just the side that you lean into.
Yeah.
I have a very high Christology, which just means it's better than yours. No. What it means is that I tend to lean into the supernatural nature of Christ.
Sure.
Or the cosmic Christ, that Christ has fully divine.
Right.
And so that's what we're talking about here. But I fully believe Christ is both in. And so some people look at the book of John and say, well, he really has a high Christology in the book of John. He does, but really what John is doing is trying to connect the two.
Yes, I would agree with you on that. Spends a lot of time talking about both, but when I think if John had to choose, he would be like you. He would choose the supernatural
And
nature
in the
of
beginning was the
Christ.
Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. It
Yeah,
starts off with this very large theological idea of
right.
Jesus.
It's very poetic in many ways, much less a narrative, than the other three gospels. So, anyway, just some cool facts there about the Gospel of John. So then we moved on into to Genesis, but then on to Joshua. And Joshua, actually, strangely, it's one of the books for me, Pastor Bruce, that really got me back into reading the Old Testament.
You spent one section last year in Joshua for
Yeah, I
felt
mean,
like months.
yeah, actually, it's almost like 2 years ago now. But yes, I did. And the reason there's just so much to glean in there because for me, eh, I really read the book of Joshua as this bridge between the people of Israel in the wilderness. So everything that came before, right? So you've got everything that gets the people of Israel to be the people of Israel living in the wilderness. So everything from the flood to slavery in Egypt, right? We've got all the stories that happen in the early parts of the Old Testament, and then we have this promised land on the other side. Well, Joshua, the book and the person, really acts in so many ways as the bridge between the wilderness and the promised land. And so we're actually going to share a Bible Project video on Joshua. It does a whole better job talking about this incredible book than we're going to be able to do here today. I encourage you to go watch that. But I thought this was interesting because when we talk about, just a few moments ago, we were talking about all the killing that we see, and there's a lot of it in Joshua. Um,
A lot of land to clear.
there's a lot of land to clear. And so we actually are coming here in Joshua 24, which is not early on in this. This is, kind of at the end. And Joshua brings the people of Israel together to make a new covenant with God. And kind of what we learn here is if they don't uphold their side, there are going to be some consequences. And so here is what Joshua has to say. It says, now fear the Lord. Sorry, this is in chapter 24, starting at verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said, and this is the part that I think is key.
And this is verse 22.
Yes, skipping to verse 22, he says, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. And so what I like about this sort of setup here is it is a reminder for us that the people of Israel at least knew what they were agreeing to. And then ultimately, again, as we see after the book of Joshua, spoiler, that don't do it. Even though they knew what the consequences were going to be, even though they knew, that they were saying, "Oh yeah, no, we'll throw away these gods, we'll worship the one true God," and then that's not what happens.
And then they fall back.
They fall back.
It's kind of like, once again, this is another line drawn. As you go through, is there were lines drawn for Abraham and Noah, and clear up through. For Joseph, there were lines drawn of make a choice. And then really for the people of Israel, there are lines drawn to make a choice. And this is another line.
Yes, make a choice. And so they did, but this is one of those where when they didn't hold up their side of the covenant, things didn't ultimately go so well. Later on in the story. So anyway, I do love the book of Joshua. It is just, oh my goodness, so much stuff in there that we can learn from. So moving on to day 25, Pastor Bruce.
Yeah, we moved to Mark.
Yeah.
So in Mark 2, Jesus heals a paralyzed man. talks about the faith of his friends. And Jesus says here, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. He's
Right.
laying out his ministry.
Yeah. And we actually see that, on the seventh day of each week's reading, we tend to sort of see like a wrap up, one or two verses that kind of gives the summary for what we just read that week. And that's actually the verse that they chose for this week, which I think was a great one. As we looked through all these readings, that's kind of, we were starting to begin to see, why did Jesus show up? What's Jesus here for? And that gives us the gist of it. We moved on to some readings in Deuteronomy, and we had a question maybe a couple weeks ago about, okay, I get the clean versus unclean, but what are some things that you can't do if you're unclean? Well, actually, here in Deuteronomy 23, it gives you a whole list of things that you can't do and participate in. So if you're curious, that would be the place to go read. And then in 1 Samuel, we're getting into some of these stories about David that, and I was a little disappointed that we didn't actually have the Psalms that went along with them this week. I thought that was kind of a miss, if I'm being real. But we're starting to get into some of these stories about David that have cross references in the Psalms,
which is really exciting, because then you're going, oh, it's David's own writing about what he was feeling and going through at the time he was going through these stories.
Right. So it's kind of cool, because what you may or may not know, that, 1st and 2nd Samuel tend to sort of be the stories that David then, if you will, journals about in the Psalms. I mean, he writes songs, but that's like, if that were, that's kind of the way to look at it. So it's a kind of a time hop there, but worth looking at.
I just realized you were talking about musicals earlier.
Yeah.
This is kind of like Psalms. It's like David's musical of his life.
It really is.
So.
It really is, that he was writing while he was hiding out. And he talks about that in there. So so you can look for that.
Day 26, spent some time in, once again, John.
Yeah.
Healing at the pool, and helps us begin to figure out who Jesus is as we see the religious leaders discover it and begin to plot against him.
Right. And here in verse 18, it actually says, for this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own father, making himself equal to God.
And so they actually are seeing him, I think, on several different levels. One has somebody who's going to disturb the peace of Rome. And anytime a false prophet, which is what they're seeing him as, or a false Messiah comes and disturbs the peace of Rome. I think if you talk to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and stuff, they'd see themselves as the heroes trying to protect.
For sure.
But
yeah, I mean, you think about that, even you take religious organizations out of it. How many times have we been a part of an organization? Let's go like a school organization, okay? And you go, well, we can't make that change because, like, that will just ruin the organization. It takes away all our tradition, or it will, whatever the reasons might be. And I think that so many of those times we're like, oh, you're right, we shouldn't make that change because that would really be terrible. And they, in many ways, were just trying to protect the church.
They were just trying to protect
the
church.
I'm not defending the Pharisees here necessarily.
But there is the parallel to the churches of our own day, which is when the church becomes self-focusing, surviving for the institution or the church itself or the church building.
Yeah.
Anytime the church becomes inward focused.
Yes.
It shrinks and dies.
Correct.
It actually fails at what the church's actual purpose is.
Correct. And when we start picking at each other, which is kind of what they're doing here, is the reality. So, so anyway, so we see here, Jesus, he heals at the pool, and, the big problem that they have is that, well, he did it on the Sabbath. How dare he heal this man at the Sabbath? So then we move into Jeremiah, and we actually get some understanding on what needs to be done to keep the Sabbath day holy.
Right.
So it helps you understand this was the law and the prophets that, the Pharisees were upholding.
Right.
That's what they were upholding. And so Jesus was, in their eyes, breaking those.
Then we jump to, Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And we begin to see the narrative on the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem after they return from exile.
Yeah.
Nehemiah, prophet, and he finds them in disrepair. and connections to where Jesus healed at the pool back in the story from John.
Yeah. So we kind of see like, oh, that place still exists.
Right.
And, we're going to get to this in just a moment, why I think this is where a Bible timeline would be cool for you to see,
Right.
What's going on there. And then in Nehemiah 12, we actually see descriptions of those who led worship. And, our own worship leader who's participating in this plan looked at this and the importance of being gatherers of people for worship. And I just thought that was such a cool connection, not to call her out for that, but
Right.
but that even, so long ago, there were people set aside and called to this ministry, whether they're preaching, teaching, leading music, whatever that might be. That, in this case, it was the Levites. It was a sect of the Levites that were set aside to lead music ministry, but that this has been a part of God's plan for thousands of years.
And therefore it was still a priestly order,
right?
Which is the cool part.
Just very cool. A lot of really neat details around that. And then we move to the book of Job.
Job. I don't have a song. I'm just going. Job 10. I had a question here. That it was somebody found it interesting the way Job called out God for creating him in his creating him if he was only going to destroy him later. That it seemed very bold.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I actually think that much of what Job has to say is quite bold. But I love it because I think it's an example that he doesn't just complain. And that's what we can't get lost in here.
Right.
In the book of Job.
He's not just whining.
He's not. He laments, and lament is different. Lament is this thing where it's complaint, but it's complaint with the understanding that God is rescuer, that there is hope. And so I think what we're really seeing here, and I don't disagree, I do think it's bold, but that what Job does is he asks God to see him and to grant him some kind of reprieve from this awful stuff that's happening.
What it reminds me of is if you go back to the Israelites coming out of the desert and complaining about everything.
Right.
And then God going, man, you know what? Why don't I just start from scratch again and I'll kill off.
Moses is like, no.
And then Moses goes, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't kill them off. What will the people of eat? And he questions God. It's the same kind of questioning of, God, what will the people of Egypt say if you just brought your chosen people who you've told me to announce are your chosen people out in the desert to kill them?
Yeah.
In the very same way, Job's lamenting acts as a prayer of, why have you left me, who I've followed you and I've been loyal to you. Why would you leave me? Did you create me just to use me as a plaything?
Right.
To leave me in such despair? Because that's not what you said. That's not what you promised us.
Yeah. I think in many ways it's kind of a call out at the unjustness that probably seems contrary to God's character to Job from what he knows of God, and which we actually know
because we're behind the curtain.
Right. If you read the whole story of Job, it actually is contrary to God's character because it's the, how is it named in the book of Job?
It's the advocate.
The advocate, is going after Job.
Yeah. It's the prosecutor.
Yeah. And so, we could get into the deep theology of...
It's the devil.
Right. We could get into the deep theology of all that today, but
it is the great Satan.
Oh my goodness. But the reality is here that Job's got it pretty bad, but what he doesn't do in the whole story of Job, he doesn't give up hope that God is his rescuer. He's just saying, God, this really... I don't understand it. This does not seem like...
God, this really sucks.
Yeah, this does not seem like your character. I need you to come through for me. And, we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast and in worship and sermons. Like when we talked through, we did a whole series on prayer about this whole idea of, circling something in prayer and, is it demanding something of God? Is that too bold? Can we be too bold for God?
Once again, check out the Psalms.
Yes.
where David is talking about how he felt.
Yeah.
And then also there's a whole book, Lamentations.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think God gives us an example for it's okay to bring our stuff to God. I really think he's okay
and
with
why
it.
are we not more bold with God?
Yeah. God can handle it.
I serve a powerful God, who, brought about the Savior of the whole world, who created all this stuff.
Do you think sometimes we think God gets God's feelings hurt in the same way that like you and I do? I just don't think God does. I'm not saying we need to be irreverent.
Right. No, I think we question our relationship with God, that sometimes I think we take the parent analogy maybe a step too far.
Uh-huh.
Okay. In the sense that, we're always taught, well, respect our parents, respect our mothers and fathers, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And we live in a world where we have to acknowledge that our mothers and fathers actually don't live up to a godly standard.
Right. We do our best.
We do our best.
Yeah.
My mom was a saint, loved my father. But oftentimes our parents can fall short. Okay. But when we come, here's the thing. If life is rough, oftentimes our parents can't do anything for us.
Right.
But we have a God who is able to.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, Job, we'll hear more of him later. So then we moved into day 27, really our last major reading day of week 4. And we take a look here. Here's Jesus again, eating on the Sabbath, picking some grain, taking off the Pharisees. And then we see Micah, which I actually found was a very interesting passage, and would encourage you maybe to go reread it or, spend a little more time there. It's not a book of the Bible we read a lot.
Tiny.
But this is actually, at least in the New International Version I was reading, entitled The Lord's Case Against Israel. And it basically, God is reminding the people of Israel, like, I've done all this stuff for you. And it lists it, here are my saving, acts in your history. And then kind of reminds the people of Israel what they've done and not done. And then this is the line that I think we pull out of Micah that most people would probably recognize. God says, but what I require of you is that you act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. And that sounds fine. And we should do that. But the reality is he's saying that because they're not.
Yeah. And if you look, there's actually, between all the stories we've read, not just for this day, but this week, there's this connection of, back to Joshua. Yeah. This is what you agreed to, folks.
Right.
And once again, we talk about Job lamenting, is God, these are the things you promised us, and I've done it all. Why are you punishing me if you won't?
Right.
Unless you are a cruel God and I'm wrong, And then you have this story dealing with this aspect of going once again a prophet, coming forth and saying, hey, guess what? God's come to me and wants me to remind you, these are all the ways you've wronged God.
Yeah.
God, don't you remember what Joshua talked about?
Yeah.
There should be some repercussions, and here are going to be the repercussions once again, but he's giving you another chance.
Right, because God is only good. God held up his end of the bargain,
right.
His end of the covenant.
So this is all you have to do. All you have to do is act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's all that God is asking you.
Yeah, but alas, they didn't do it.
Then jump into 2 Chronicles, and Solomon is building the temple, and we can see the care taken.
Oh,
here,
yeah, the level of
small detail.
Amazing. I mean, I actually reread that a couple of times because just the level of detail, like the number of pomegranates and the netting that went on it's just unbelievable.
Well, it's crazy talk, but the interesting thing about this story that I'm sure we'll get into at some point is, did God ask for a temple?
That's one that we'll have to dig into later, Pastor Bruce.
Because I remember God asking for a tabernacle.
Yeah.
But did he ask for a permanent temple?
Now you're asking like a big old question that we're going to have to come to on another day. But day 28, as we look at that, it really, again, was that recap from Mark chapter 2, verse 17. The verse that talks about Jesus didn't come for the healthy, but for the sick. And really, that's been our theme of this week is all of these things in the Old Testament, these hard stories. Really, what it's getting down to is this: that we're a people that are messed up. We've sinned. We've separated ourselves from God. God is looking for a way to bring us back into right relationship and enter Jesus. So that's your week 4 recap. We're going to go ahead and look ahead at our week 5 readings, which actually this video will come out kind of in the middle of, but want to kind of look ahead and give you some tools and encouragement for these 7 days. So this week we're back in, I think, another 17 books of the Bible. Pastor Bruce is what I counted. We're going to be in Mark and Exodus, Jeremiah, Job, Luke, Proverbs, Psalms, Isaiah, Matthew, Numbers, 2 Samuel, 2 Chronicles, 2 Kings, Zechariah, 1 Chronicles, Ezekiel, and Malachi.
17.
Whew, it's good. And I mentioned this earlier. The way this plan is, and I really am loving it the more I get into it, all the connections. But, as you start to get into these, you may find yourself reading a story going, well, how'd they end up there? Like, wait a minute. Like, I know for me, as I was reading Nehemiah, I was trying to string together where that happened in the timeline again. Because reading it out of chronology, you go, well, hold up, where'd that go? And so if you're struggling with that, like, I did this week, there are a couple of good resources that we're going to put in the video links. One of them is the Bible Project. It's just like an overview of the Old Testament. So it's kind of going to hit the high level themes and some of the big stuff that happens in there. It's about 12 minutes long. Would really encourage you to go watch that. And then Pastor Bruce stumbled across a cool resource called BibleTimeline.com. I'll put that link in the video notes as well. That's an interactive Bible timeline. So you can
you just drag your mouse over things and it'll take you to different pages.
Really cool. So that might be one of those to keep up on your computer when you're reading the Bible. If you got a question, you can be like, what, when did that happen? Oh, here. So that's it.
And speaking of questions, how can they reach us?
Well, as always, we would love it if you put your questions in the Talk It Over section of YouVersion. If you're using the app, that's the easiest and best way to, for us to find those questions. But you can also email, or, just find us on a Sunday, let us know, and we'll try to get those questions in there for you.
Yeah,
so
make sure to stick with it, folks. We're 4 weeks in, a lot of stuff, a long way to go. Stick with it, catch up if you need to, and always share your comments and discussion with the group in the Talk It Out section. We're enjoying it.
Yeah.
We're having a good time.
Hope you are too. And, don't get frustrated or disappointed if you've gotten behind. Just jump back in, join us where you are. There's never a wrong time to start reading the Bible. And with this plan, it's not really all that much in order. So you can kind of read each day just for each day. Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you. If you're starting really late, just join us where we are.
Yeah. That would be my absolute
just join us where we are
recommendation.
And just go back and read what you can. And,
all right.
Time by time.
Well, that has been it for our week 4 recap and our look ahead to week 5. So we will see you back here next week. Once again, I'm Sarah.
I'm Pastor Bruce.
And have a blessed week reading the Bible.